Listo.
Listo, dice que en 2 minutos.
Vai começar em mais quase 2 minutos, 1 minuto e 30.
En el minuto 50.
Sí, sí.
Dice que aquí ya estamos.
Listo.
Listo. Dice que en 2 minutos.
É porque ustedes está dentro de los site e também dentro de los Zoom. Então, tem este delay de praticamente 30 segundos.
Ok, entonces comenzamos ya, yo creo. ¿Listo? Buenos días a todos.
Não começou ainda neste momento. Não começou para mim.
¿Sí comenzó?
Perfeito, pode começar.
Listo. Buenos días a todos. Gracias por conectarse a nuestro stand. Como lo hemos venido realizando, este es nuestro segundo día aquí en Tactical Edge. Estamos muy contentos. El día de hoy queremos contarles un poco más al detalle y mostrar en vivo nuestra solución que nos acompaña, que es XM Cyber. Dentro de todo lo que hacemos en ART2SEC, manejamos la AAA del ciberzorro, astucia, adaptabilidad y automatización, donde buscamos aplicar la estrategia de defensa activa. El día vamos a apoyarnos en Chris, quien es el director de ingeniería de XM Cyber, y mostraremos en vivo cómo esta plataforma nos permite dar esa inteligencia a los vectores de ataque. Vamos a poder mostrar en detalle cómo funciona, los beneficios, para que las compañías puedan siempre contestarse si realmente todas esas joyas de la corona que manejamos a diario están totalmente seguras. No me quiero extender, quiero darles la bienvenida, decirles que vamos a estar acá en contacto. En caso de preguntas, en caso de dudas o mayor información, pueden navegar dentro de nuestro stand e invitarlos mañana a las 3 de la tarde a la charla que dará Eduardo con el mayor detalle de en qué consisten estos equipos púrpura, que es la convergencia del Blue Team al Red Team. No siendo más, bienvenidos y dejo ya a Eduardo.
Perfeito. Buenos días. Solamente un minuto. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. Depende do horário que ustedes conseguem. Sí, perfeito. Ele é só um minuto que Chris, ele é o nosso diretor de solução, de engenharia de solução, está aí participando. Estou sincronizando com Chris neste exato momento. Eduardo, sou representante da XM Cyber para Central América e também a América Latina. Ele fazer uma breve introdução. O tema de hoje é nova geração de Breach and Attack Simulation. Então, nós temos um minuto, por favor. Nós temos uma responsabilidade, a XM Cyber, de poder fazer o desenvolvimento desse mercado, vender as soluções e também apoiar o time técnico para poder mostrar os benchmarks devidos e também ser uma solução que é uma solução disruptiva, uma solução inovadora e uma solução de BAS que cobrimos todos os pontos sobre os finds. Irei demonstrar um pouquinho adiante. Ela solamente a ser uma introdução. Eu tenho mais de 15 anos de tecnologia, então tenho 12 anos, praticamente 12 anos de segurança da informação e também de cibersegurança. E eu tenho 8 anos focado nos mercados da América Central, América do Norte e também da América Latina. Eu passei por algumas organizações, como o Banco Bradesco, a parte financeira, UI, Porto Seguro, a maior empresa de seguros do Brasil e também o cartão de crédito, tarjeta de crédito Elo. Então, sou responsável novamente pelo crescimento, pela expansão e também pelo mercado de Latinoamérica e Central América. E temos Chris. Chris é nosso diretor de solução da XM Cyber. Chris, can you hear me?
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Chris, can you explain for your biography?
Oh, perfect. Yes, I work here with Eduardo, supporting XM Cyber. I have about 20 years of experience that started in the government sector, dealing with threat intelligence. From there, I worked at Chevron, helped build out the intelligence center there, cybersecurity functions, and I've been in the vendor space now for 5 years with FireEye, Flashpoint, and Eyesight partners, and look forward to our discussion today.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Chris. A nossa empresa, ela é uma empresa de aproximadamente 5 anos. Ela foi fundada em 2016, onde ela foi fundada dos fundadores da empresa. Ela é uma companhia israelí fundada por ex-chefe do Mossad, por isso, ex-chefe do Mossad e outros veteranos, por isso, o nome é XM Cyber. Então, desde aquele momento, estamos tendo uma plataforma de Breach and Attack Simulation enfocado em todos os territórios e todas essas regiões, onde eu sou responsável pela região da América Central e da América Latina. Nós temos por volta de 73 empregados dentro da XM Cyber. Como falei para vocês, é uma companhia israelí e temos também escritório, headquarter Américas em Dallas, Texas, onde está o time de executivo, o time de channels e também uma parte do time operacional e também o time de ventas. Temos outro grupo de pessoas dentro da XM Cyber em New York, que são nossos pesquisadores e também nossos engenheiros de segurança. E também temos pessoas na Califórnia e no Canadá para suportar North America. Então, dentro desta companhia, também temos escritório em United Kingdom e também na Austrália. Temos 50 grandes clientes, 50 clientes médios e grandes clientes, onde temos os melhores segmentos, os segmentos que mais nos demandam, que as instituições financeiras, a parte de governo, a parte de indústria e também a parte de infraestrutura crítica. Temos cliente já implantado nossa solução no Brasil, Energisa, e também temos alguns prêmios e algumas patentes. Temos por volta de mais de 25 prêmios, ela focada em cybersecurity, ela parte também de Breach and Attack Simulation. Temos mais de 40 patentes e também temos alguns financiamentos por Macquarie Capital, Nasdaq e também o nosso fundo de inovação. Então, ela é uma empresa que recentemente ganhou como prêmio de Gartner Co-Vendor, que significa que é uma solução disruptiva, uma solução intrigante e também uma solução inovadora, além de outros prêmios nesses 3 últimos anos muito significativos. Eu tenho deck para explicar para vocês dos principais segmentos, como havia dito para vocês no slide anterior. Na parte de finance, temos na parte de critical infrastructure, temos na parte de industrial, temos na parte de insurance e temos outras empresas que estamos trabalhando neste momento, neste ano de 2020, para que nós conseguimos fazer uma implantação dentro de todos esses mercados, certo? E a missão dessa XM Cyber nós dividimos em 3 grandes missões. A parte de Risk Assessment, onde nós conseguimos automatizar e permitir que ele tenha os modelos de ataque, ela focada na visibilidade da sua rede, ela através de uma POC, ela através da nossa plataforma. Temos uma segunda parte, uma parte de priorização e remediação, que é uma parte que nós conseguimos encontrar as misconfigurations no ambiente e as vulnerabilidades explotáveis e também o comportamento e a atividade do usuário. E a última parte, uma validação, onde nós temos mais que 20 patentes para executar-se de forma segura e escalável para o ambiente de produção do cliente. Então, por que as grandes redes, com as grandes redes sendo complexas, interconectadas e constantemente cambiando, por que ela é um problema? Porque hoje temos um cenário de los 5 ou 10 anos atrás, onde tínhamos solamente um ambiente on-prem, onde tínhamos o perímetro totalmente controlado fisicamente e logicamente. Nos dias de hoje, o funcionário e os empregados, os terceiros, estão trabalhando em outras localidades, fora de uma base perimetral física, então ela é solamente através de controles lógicos e as redes estão em todas as partes. E hoje temos muitas configurações errôneas e também vulnerabilidades sendo publicadas por fabricantes a cada dia. Então, cada semana, vocês têm um fabricante de diferente parte da infraestrutura, onde tem esta parte de publicação, onde nós sabemos essa publicação, onde temos um time de Exim Cyber que lá conseguem fazer uma comunicação com a parte de MitriAttack e também o desenvolvimento das técnicas para poder fazer uma remediação de uma forma mais acurada, embarcada dentro da nossa plataforma, que irei explicar para vocês um pouquinho adiante. E também, um dos grandes fatores é o erro humano, onde temos inúmeros erros humanos para que isto facilita os finds, as vulnerabilidades, as misconfigurations, o comportamento do usuário que abrem uma brecha para os atacantes. Por que os hackers têm êxito hoje em dia? Porque no campo de batalha, o battleground não é justo. Primeiro, os hackers têm todos os tempos do mundo e todo o tempo do mundo para poder executar, para poder testar, para poder pegar informações, para poder compartilhar conhecimento, pegar informações através da dark web, de fóruns, de comunidades, de todas as formas possíveis para burlar, para passar as proteções dos sistemas. E também as pessoas, segundo Ponemon Institute e outras organizações que pesquisam sobre o assunto, um número muito escasso dos profissionais de ciberseguridade. Então, nós temos a parte de Blue Team e também a parte de Red Team. E a parte de Red Team, como vocês conhecem, elas são serviços que vocês contratam ou uma equipe interna ou recurso interna para poder simular tentativas de penetrar este tipo de rede ou sistemas, identificar a vulnerabilidade, o papel que ela ataca a empresa. Temos o time de Blue Team, que também tem que ter esse tipo de conhecimento para desenvolver as estratégias de defesa, modificando e também reagrupando os mecanismos de proteção de rede para que cada vez fique mais forte, para que ele consiga definir e melhorar e também implantar as melhores brechas, porque ele tem um profundo conhecimento da infraestrutura e também das táticas e as técnicas que são feitas para poder fazer este ataque. Então, a equipe púrpura, a nossa plataforma tem um papel de automatizar toda esta forma de vetores e rotas de ataque para que nós conseguimos, de uma forma automatizada, entregar para o Blue Team através de conselhos priorizados por riscos de uma melhor forma, de uma forma mais assertiva e uma forma mais eficaz e mais rápida para poder fazer este tipo de remediação. E uma plataforma que vocês conseguem fazer de uma forma contínua, de uma forma 24/7 por 365. E lá temos normalmente os clientes do Exim Cyber e de todas essas empresas, temos que responder 3 perguntas fundamentais. A primeira, através do Risk Management, estão seguros nossos ativos críticos? Normalmente, é uma pergunta que hacemos para o cliente. Os seus ativos críticos estão seguros? Priorização. Quando vocês encontram qualquer tipo de evento, qualquer tipo de find, por onde ustedes empiezam. Então, por uma vulnerabilidade pequena, que tem um baixo risco, que tem um alto risco. Então, como que nós conseguimos definir isto e a nossa plataforma consegue te ajudar? E também uma validação. Não la arreglamos corretamente. Ou seja, nós estamos validando este tipo de brecha, este tipo de vetor de ataque para que ela consiga fazer uma remediação de uma forma muito mais acurada. E aí que entra a XM Cyber, que é uma ferramenta de simulação, validação, que te dá conselhos para que vocês consigam fazer uma remediação priorizada por riscos e de uma forma contínua 24/7 por 365. E nisso, vocês têm uma representação gráfica muito fácil de poder ter uma visibilidade de um step by step de todas as rotas de ataque, de todos os vetores de ataque dentro da solução. É uma solução que pode estar em três grandes ambientes. No ambiente on-prem, e a console, perdão. No ambiente on-prem, no ambiente da XM Cyber, com a infraestrutura em cloud da XM Cyber, e também uma estrutura em cloud do cliente. Então, para a parte on-prem, nós precisamos instalar sensores, porque são sensores e não agentes. É um fragmento de um agente onde tem uma baixa performance, que tem uma proteção contra a movimentação lateral, escalação de privilégio. Vocês não precisam fazer uma reinicialização desse sensor quando instalados em sistemas operativos Windows, Mac e Linux, tanto para o workstation e também para servidores, e para o ambiente em Azure, e também para o ambiente em Amazon, AWS. Vocês solamente fazer uma sincronização de contas para que vocês consigam ter uma visibilidade através da permissão dessa conta para todos os recursos que estão na nuvem. Então, ela é uma plataforma que ela consegue identificar continuamente estes vetores, esses caminhos de ataque. Então, vocês têm uma técnica para encontrar configurações errôneas, um problema de acesso dos usuários, e também vocês podem acompanhar de três formas. Através das próprias campanhas. Cris vai falar um pouquinho mais dentro da apresentação técnica, da demo técnica. Vocês podem acompanhar dentro do Blue Team Report, onde vocês têm uma forma técnica para poder discutir com seu Blue Team a melhor forma de poder tratar esses riscos, e também através do dashboard, onde ele apresenta todos os cenários, os vetores, as principais ameaças, para que vocês tenham uma visibilidade de toda a sua infraestrutura e todo o teste. E com isso, vocês têm uma forma de se tornar visível de uma forma holística. Então, uma plataforma de Breach and Attack Simulation é totalmente diferente de solamente um scan de vulnerabilidade, de solamente um pen testing, de um pen testing automatizado. Então, ela é uma parte que nós trabalhamos com 4 grandes grupos. No primeiro grupo, nós trabalhamos com a parte de exploits e vulnerabilidades, todas essas suportadas pelo Mitre Ataque. E no segundo grupo, pela parte de segmentação de rede. E no terceiro grupo, nós trabalhamos com a parte de misconfiguration. E no quarto grupo, nós trabalhamos com a parte de comportamento de usuário. Embarcados todas essas, temos técnicas, temos patentes, temos um conhecimento interno dentro da ferramenta para poder mostrar. Cris vai demonstrar para vocês um pouquinho mais a fundo na parte técnica, mas nós trabalhamos para diminuir a janela de exposição e também de uma forma contínua. Chris?
Yes.
Can you share your screen?
Perfect.
Yep.
So just let Eduardo stated, we're going to look at various facets of an environment to determine the attack pass to assets. And so I think that's a key critical difference. We're not just determining how many different CVs are vulnerable on a given endpoint. We're showing you the pathways that real threat actors will take to compromise your most critical assets. And so with that, we're going to answer 3 primary questions today with this demonstration. 1, what are those attack paths that threat actors can take to compromise critical data and information? Secondly, once we identify those attack paths, what are the major gaps needing remediation? And then thirdly, how do you monitor risk over time? And with that, we have a holistic risk dashboard that will collate everything from this red teaming component we're looking at now to the blue teaming component to give you that security posture risk management as well. And so with that, we are in the battleground. So this is the red teaming portion of XM Cyber. We are going to, from here, describe what we're seeing. So first, you see hexagon. So this is a depiction of a hybrid cloud environment. Within that, we're going to attempt to traverse from the corporate zone into AWS, specifically to compromise customer data resident in S3 buckets. And so the way that XM Cyber runs these scenarios is by creating just that, a scenario comprised of 3 things. 1, a breach point, a starting point, which I'll show you in just a moment. Secondly, what is that key critical data? And so the way that we look at your environment, we can look at this from a subsection, a subnet. We can look at it as types of information, Swift Outlook data, or we can look at it as specific entities, S3 buckets, which will be in this scenario, specific servers, specific computers as well. So people use this, customers also use this for executive protection, for looking at attack paths to critical data like PCI, customer information like we're testing today, and then also to replicate specific types of threat activities such as propagating ransomware. And so these are just examples that to show you that we often create and help our customers with. The last thing to note is this is going to replay the attack. And so this is essentially a replay of threat activity as we are able to determine it. With that, you can view this how you like to view your network. So if you prefer to replay attacks and view your network from that subnet perspective mentioned earlier, if you like to look at it from a domain or an OU group, these are all options for any scenario you create and run with XM Cyber. And so with that, we'll go ahead and start the replay of the attack. One thing to note here, you see everything is gray. So essentially nothing has occurred from a threat activity perspective yet. As we press play, we will start to replay the threat activity. As we do this, I'm going to pause briefly to describe what you're seeing. And we will pause in 1 moment. Great. So I'm going to pause right now. As stated, we were starting threat activity from the corporate zone. And so with that, I'll explain what you're seeing. First off, a breach point. As stated, we look at this as a capture the flag scenario. We're going to start with a breach point because we assume breach, because we know it eventually will happen. And from here, we then randomize this every time we replay. So for this specific attack, we're starting from Alex. There's a halo around it. Think of this as a bullseye. It's red because he is compromised. As entities that are gray turn blue, this identifies that they have been reconned and discovered. And this type of color coding not only goes to specific entities, endpoint servers, it will also be depicted in the way we visualize your network. So here you see this cluster specifically has now been completely reconned, whereas this one with 1 server is compromised. So we will also show you the percentile of compromise within your network. And then the last thing to note are the critical assets. So I mentioned this S3 buckets, and here you see one of these S3 buckets here of critical financial customer data. You see here they're diamond shapes, diamond because these are your critical assets, which are crown jewels, and so we depict that differently from the other entities within your environment. And so from there, we will continue to replay the attack. Just like real threat activity, what are we doing? We create a foothold within your environment. We are then going to try to traverse, determine what areas are most porous that will allow us to link specific compromises to pivot, traverse, and eventually compromise the critical asset. And as you see here, we've now moved from the on-premises to the cloud environment, and we finally do indeed compromise that critical asset. So as this is replayed, you can see this real time in XM Cyber. Once it is completed and we've completed the attack replay, you can select the specific asset. And with that, I'm going to zoom in, and then once you select it, you can look at the attack path. And so zooming out real quickly, at a high level, you see here essentially 5 lateral movements, but you see the number 7 here. So what does this mean? There's essentially 7 specific events that had to occur in this environment to allow us to traverse to and compromise that critical asset. And so once we do compromise it, we see this visualization. And then from here, we open, as you see here to the left-hand side, the attack pane. So think of this as the anatomy of the attack. This is going to go over and explain to you exactly what occurred in the environment, misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, and legitimate user activity that we were able to compromise to show you and create that attack path to that critical asset. And so as you replay this, you can then select these within XM Cyber to see exactly what occurred. So with that, we'll zoom in here and we'll do just that. So first step, we identified that from Alex, the breach point, we can traverse to and compromise Olivia's endpoint by leveraging the CVE Blue Keep. So most of you are probably familiar with this. This is a remote desktop service, RDS-RDP vulnerability that can be exploited specifically to Olivia. And as we identify this within your environment, it's very important to note that we typically run continuously, and you will get a date time group. So here you see in this specific attack replay, we identified this vulnerability can be exploited specifically on May 4th at this specific time in UTC. That is important because as you look for continuous monitoring, there are going to be changes on a minute and daily basis within your environment. And as these changes occur, we will be able to show you either things that are more vulnerable to compromise or maybe things that you have patched which become less susceptible to compromise and do not allow for the type of threat activity we've identified here. From there, what are we going to do? We're going to look at Olivia's endpoint and determine if there's anything within it that can then allow us to traverse into a different section of the network. And so you see here, although Olivia is in sales and marketing, she actually has administrative privileges on her machine. So likely left on to allow others to remote in and to maybe configure, update her endpoint. This though allows her susceptible to credential harvesting, which you see here. We're able to grab those administrative privileges. From there, we traverse back to Alex, and then you see here, we can leverage those credentials to gain a foothold into the secure zone. So here you see we're now in a different section and subnet. We're actually in a different country now. Stephen is in IT. He's also resident in India in this scenario. And so through credential harvesting and reuse, we confirmed that we can use those harvested credentials to log in and access Stephen's computer. And again, noting that we give you that date time group, we confirm that this attack path is possible and validate it. Once we're on Stephen's endpoint, just like we did with Olivia, we're going to harvest and see what is within Stephen's computer, his workstation, that would allow us to then traverse one step further into the network and gain a foothold within AWS. And so just like you saw with Olivia, unfortunately, in this case, Stephen has stored his AWS CLI keys in clear text. So what does this mean? Those are the CLI keys that allow him to access his user key and then ultimately his AWS user. These are unfortunately stored in clear text on his endpoint. And so with that, we're able to grab those with an access key stealer method. And from there, we are then able to log in and access his key, gain access control. And with that, we can then log in and have access onto his AWS user. And here you see we've been able to use that key to access his user. And so from there, what's next? So now we have assumed control of Stephen's AWS user account. And with that, we now have all the privileges and access he has as a legitimate user within the AWS cloud environment. And so from here, we identified that indeed the S3 bucket we are attempting to compromise, he has access to. And so now we see that Stephen not only has read access, he has write access to that specific data. What does this mean? This means that we have the ability to read, write, exfil, delete that information, that sensitive customer information. And so again, 7 events and specific steps within the network that allowed us to traverse from the corporate zone into the cloud, and then indeed compromise that specific S3 bucket of critical customer information. And so from here, you see there's a lot of different red and blue. We've honed it down into that specific attack path. More importantly, we're going to then take that attack path to then determine what are the specific gaps that need remediation first. And so we're going to look at criticality based off of that specific asset in question. And so from here, we auto-generate a what I believe was referred to before as a blue team remediation report. So you go up here to the top, you can then select the report. The report will then open. And from here, it starts with a basic overview. One thing to note of the report, this is exportable. So while these are resident in the platform, you can select and export any of these different sections. We're going to look at here the overview, the critical asset findings, the all findings. We're also going to get into the device findings as it relates to choke points as well. So here, what do you see first? You see exactly what we just accomplished in the battleground. So the percentage of devices that were compromised, reconned, and undiscovered. From there, we're going to show you the critical attack methods that were necessary to get to and compromise that S3 bucket. So first, you see here that last lateral movement, AWS. You see then here also the CVE as well, and other specific findings and attack methods that were necessary. I'm going to select the CVE to give you a perspective of how we look at remediation from a CVE perspective, and then also highlight local credentials, because this is, of course, systemic and was a big problem within this specific campaign. And so from here, for every attack method we identify in any scenario within XM Cyber, we're going to give you the same identification of the threat. So first, we're going to define it. So what is it? What are the details? First, what are the severity and complexity, right? This is a very high severity, right? Blue Keep is very high severe, but it's actually pretty low complexity. You then get categorization. This is, of course, a vulnerability, a description, and this maps back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So we actually link back in. We're a partner contributor to the MITRE ATT&CK framework as well. So from here, then you can do additional analysis and then also pull in specific information on the specific TTP ID. You then see the affected entities. So this was, of course, Olivia you saw that was susceptible to this type of compromise. Then we get into remediations. So remediations are going to start at a high level, right? Think of security best practices. Think of policy settings. So what are you going to do? Likely you need to look at appropriate patches within Microsoft. That's an obvious, and maybe disable RDP. More importantly, when we get to remediations on a CVE, what we try to do at XM Cyber is not just tell you to patch. That's obvious. And we know that there's also policy around that. This might be something that is out of band or out of cycle for your patching. You might not be able to go and patch Olivia's computer. However, what you could do is you could take these other steps within your environment, such as enabling the NLA, network level authentication, or just disabling the remote desktop service on that specific machine. We'll give you that parameter here, which is in CSV format, and then you can move on. So we try to go, the point of showing you this is we try to go beyond just patching to give you different things you can take, remediations you can take within your environment to block the kill chain. And one more to show you here from the attack vector perspective, local credentials. So identify credentials through credential harvesting that you saw in the red teaming component. More importantly here, again, same description, complexity, mapping to MITRE. More importantly, we're going to try to give you options, right? We always try to give you remediation options because we understand everyone's environment is different and that it takes different steps to you defend your network. And so with that, we give you 5 options here for the local credential issue, and a few to point out. Implementing password management is one thing. Disabling users for remote user groups, right? So here you see the built-in access on Steven. Essentially just disabling that administrative access will eliminate this from being an issue within your environment. Or you can enable user access control. Again, this is going to be for Steven as well. to give you examples. So as stated, we try to give you up to 5, 6 specific remediations. You only have to select one and action one to block this malicious activity within your environment. The last thing to show you on this is, and we're going to jump back into the battleground real quickly, is all devices. So here we list every single device with the inbound and outbound attack methods. More importantly, rather than just looking at every single entity within the environment, what we can show you are choke points. So what is a choke point? Think of a choke point as an essential entity that we had to compromise to get to that asset. And so you see here, I've selected this already. And essentially there are 5 choke points within this environment that created that attack path. So why look at it from this perspective? This is just a different way to look at it, more from the attack surface perspective. So the first thing we showed you were the attack methods and vectors that were necessary to get to and compromise the asset. We then flip it on its head and say, okay, what was necessary to compromise to get to that asset? And so here you see there's 5 entities, and from there you can select them visually here. More importantly, as you select them and you see the attack paths in an outbound, you can then go back into the remediation port I just showed you. This is the subsection within the entity, and then you can drill into Steven. So Steven is a choke point within this scenario. We have to compromise Steven's computer to compromise the S3 bucket in this campaign scenario. And so with this, what do you see? You see a complexity of the compromise. You see basics on Steven's endpoint. More importantly, you get the same visualization you get within the battleground. So you can see the inbound attack paths, how we were able to compromise Steven's. You then get outbound. So from Steven, where can we go, right? So we see that we compromise the keys, of course, and the users. And then lastly, we see that because Steven is a choke point, we have to determine how we can harden and remediate his endpoint. And again, we give you a lot of different examples and remediations that you can take. Of course, you just need to take one of these. It can be disabling the users from the user groups as shown before, enabling UAC, adding whitelisting, or blocking ports for specific traffic. If you enact one of these in this scenario, you take Steven out of the equation, we can still compromise AWS. We can still get into the cloud in this scenario, but without Steven, we cannot compromise the critical asset. And so this is important from remediation standpoint, because you look at this way, you can essentially remediate one endpoint and stop this malicious activity and drastically reduce your risk exposure for this specific scenario against these assets. And so from remediation, we then also lastly have our dashboard. And so from here we have, go ahead.
Chris, before you show this dashboard, could you create the simple scenario to understand the breach points and critical assets and schedule? Oh, nice.
Sure, great. So that's a good point. So here you see all of the different scenarios we're currently running here in this environment. More importantly, how do you create a scenario? So this is a good thing to go over, since this is the basis and kind of genesis of how you use XM Cyber. Quite simple. You press this button. You can name this anything you want, but you want to think of it based off of what you want to test against from the attack surface perspective. So as we're talking about AWS, I'm going to run one against S3 buckets. Test 4. You press confirm. Once you create it, you're going to see the scope. So what does this mean? These are all the entities within your environment that we can test against. For this, we're going to leave it open. However, if you want to replicate specific threat activity, for instance, say you have an incident response, you have a major incident, and it's only dealing with a couple of subnets, a portion, a subsection of your environment, you can scope this down and only test certain areas of your environment. From here, you define the breach points. So you do have to select one breach point. After that, we randomize it every time we replay the attack. You can again look at this from a device, data, network, or cloud perspective. For this, I'm just going to select device and look at computers and select Alfred. You can add the rule from here. Next, critical assets. So for today, we mentioned cloud. We're going to select cloud, and then we're going to look at all the entities. And so this will show you all the entities within AWS, and then also Azure that we're currently running against. For this scenario, we mentioned S3 buckets. You click on this, you will then see all the S3 buckets in your environment. You can select one or you can select all. You add the rule. The last step before we get to the final settings is exclusions. So at XM Cyber, the way we look at it is that all threat actors are going to try whatever's possible to traverse your network, right? They're not going to come with only 5 tools, and if they don't work, leave your environment, right? Sophisticated actors are going to have a large repository of methods, TTPs, and specific attack vectors that they can leverage in your environment to get to the assets they're trying to compromise. And so from here, we look at this as looking inclusive. We want to show you all the specific attack vectors possible. With that said, if you want to replicate a very specific type of threat activity, say you've observed FIN7, APT29 in your environment, and you only want to look at very specific methods, you can exclude. So if you can say, I know that FIN7 doesn't use DNS poisoning, you can select here and exclude that. For today, we're going to leave this all in, but just an example, if you're looking at replicating very specific threat activity, you want to see how an attack that has been observed in maybe your environment or in a partner's environment in industry, if you want to replicate that, it's very easy to replicate very specific threat activity and specific attacks here within XM Cyber. And so the last thing are the settings. So here you see the name of the scenario. Of course, you can always go back and change this. You can add a description, testing attack pass to S3 buckets. You're going to look at running this for 1 day, every 1 day. So what does this mean? We're going to run this 24 hours. And then as we hit that 25th hour, we're going to replay the attack. So we're going to continuously run this every day with today as the starting date and no end date. The last thing, these are 2 final options, multiple attack vectors. You can enable this. This will allow us to continuously find inbound and outbound attack paths to those assets. You can change it if you want to look at it every 1 minute. You can also enable dynamic breach points. So what does this mean? Dynamic breach points means that we created that one, we selected Alfred. From here, we're only limited by the size of your environment. So if you want to test against 20, 100, 200, every time we replay, we will randomize the starting point and start from a new computer every time we replay the attack. And that's it. You press review and you create the scenario. And so as it's created, you see here, it's just loaded within my platform right here. This is the one we just created. More importantly, as this, and I'll show this real quickly since we have a little time, as this is created, you don't have to wait for 24 hours to start to see results. So we can go ahead and click on the battleground, and you can see we've already started to recon the environment here. And so as you press play, you can watch this real time as we have observed this. So I just created this. You saw me just create this about 60 seconds ago. We have already started to run threat activity against the environment. And so if you press play, you can essentially run this continuously. Some customers will run this in the SOC if they're worried about specific critical assets to determine if there's new attack paths real time. And so I think that's just important to note. You don't have to wait for a day, for a week, for results to occur. You can see them unfold as we determine ways to recon and compromise your environment. And so again, as we look at this red teaming component, the blue teaming component, we then collate all this different information into a risk dashboard. And so you first get a alphanumeric risk score rating, 0 to 100, A, B, C, D, E, F is for scoring. You get linear benchmarks, and so this is trend lines over the different scenarios. You then are able to traverse back into the reports. More importantly, what we're looking at here are all scenarios. So you can filter this based off of just one scenario if you want to see that, or all scenarios, which will show, and you can see here all the different scenarios we're running within a given environment to see the holistic risk. So here you'll likely want to look at all of these. Here we're depicting all of these scenarios, and from there you then get specific trends. So what are you seeing here? First, you get what's most easily compromised. So we'll show you these computers were very easy for us to compromise. and how they are most at risk. You then get a perspective from the critical assets. So as you saw in the scenario created in the customer data scenario we ran in this demonstration, if you look at the critical assets, we're going to show you all the names of those assets you've identified, the complexity, and the monthly trend over time, right? So is it getting more at risk or less at risk? Is your risk going up and down? Is it increasing or decreasing based off entities? You can also select these entities and look at all of them specific. These are all the critical assets you've identified within your environment with all the different impacts. Going back to the dashboard, you will also get the top asset impacted entities, the top compromised entities. So how many were compromised the most? You see here this as well. You'll get the list with the affected entities, the critical assets, the complexity of the methods, and the specific methods that we use to compromise those entities. And then the last thing to note on the dashboard is the attack method. So as you saw with the critical asset findings in the blue team report, we identified a handful of methods that were necessary to compromise critical assets. What we do here is we then collate all these on all the scenarios you're running to tell you which ones are most impactful. So which specific attack vectors are you most susceptible to, and which were we able to leverage the most to compromise your critical assets, and then also any entities within your environment. And so from here, you can view all the attack methods. Again, going back into report, you'll get a high-level overview of this, what it is, the mapping to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, the critical assets at risk, and the complexity. So you get a report here as well that you look at from that critical asset perspective that will list all of these specific attack methods that were necessary to compromise your assets.
Chris, lastly, could
Yes.
you show so quickly the integration with SIEM, ATP, and AWS, and show the tab of sensors?
Sure. So that's a good segue into this. So lastly, of course, we've shown you all the capabilities. To get into how it actually works, we have a system configuration component. And so here, of course, we're running this as a SaaS product in the cloud. We can also run this on premises as well. So we do have roughly about, I would say, 10% of our customer base that wants this completely air-gapped in their network. We can, of course, provide this as well. It's essentially a database and 2 servers that we host, or you can host in your environment. And so from here, you get the overview of the health of the system. Is it working? Is everything working properly? You get the north, the south servers, which are the top 2 servers, and then the sensors as well. From here, we'll show you that. So we do deploy sensors, as mentioned before. What does that mean? These are lightweight sensors taking up less than 0.02% CPU usage. We also monitor CPU memory and disk space. Why do we do this? We run in a lot of sophisticated financial environments, one being NASDAQ. NASDAQ was a customer of ours, liked our product so much they invested in us, and so they're one of our primary investors. And the reason they run us continuously within their environment is because we're able to identify and validate attack paths without taking up a lot of space and memory within their endpoints. More importantly, we have a patented technology. As we look at the CPU memory and disk space, if we notice a spike, we have a fuse mechanism within XM Cyber that will then shut down our sensor. And so why would we do that? We never want to impact production. So if we notice a spike in CPU or memory or disk space on a server, maybe you're making an update, a configuration changing, we will shut down for roughly 24 hours and then retest the next day to see if it's safe for us to run in your environment. And so that's a specific patented technology we have within XM Cyber, and one of the reasons why NASDAQ became an investor. And so from there, once you're deployed, I'll show you real quickly. Again, this is all deployed and managed here. There's no reboots, there's no specific UI, there's no GUI. You basically download an MSI file here. You see the versioning for Windows, Linux, and Mac. We do support Red Hat, CentOS as well. From there, they're all managed here, and you can do any kind of configuration necessary. All the advanced settings are here. If you need to uninstall, for instance, you just select them and make the changes here. As far as integrations, so general settings, let's look at this real quick. We do currently configure against AWS, Microsoft MDATP, and also with Azure. To show you an example of how we integrate with cloud, it's a very basic configuration. So you log into XM Cyber, you log into your applicable AWS accounts, you create a stack, you grab the ARN, you test the role here, and that's all you need. And so what we're doing here is we're assuming a security audit read-only role within your cloud environment. So we can only read the configurations and understand where entities are. We cannot make any changes to your cloud environment. However, from here, we're able to, one, configure this with an API-only integration, and then from there, we're able to run these attack paths. And literally, this takes about 15 to 20 minutes to set up, and within that first day, we can run attacks against your cloud environment. Last thing to hear is also Microsoft Defender Adp. So we do have a formal integration there. How does this work? Essentially, you can then look at specific vulnerabilities from MDATP. You can tag those entities and then create attack scenarios here. And you'll get the same data back and forth between XM Cyber. The criticality we observe from our attack paths can be populated within MDATP as well. And then lastly, as someone mentioned, SIM. So we do have our RESTful API integrations and all the configuration for the server here directly. We have customers running this in various SIM environments, include Splunk, ArcSight, QRadar. And from here, you get the basic settings from the log perspective and then the events as well. So you can see here the different events. Of course, anything you see within XM Cyber is a field. So if there's something specific you would want to correlate against beyond the basic configuration. We work with customers all the time to ensure that they get the necessary reporting out of XM Cyber. Anything else to add from this?
We appreciate, Chris, your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Wonderful presentation. Julie?
Thanks, Chris. Very good presentation. Thanks. Gracias a todos. Realmente, como les decíamos, en ART2SEC hacemos ciberseguridad AAA. Todo lo que tiene que ver con la parte de adaptabilidad, XM Cyber nos acompaña, exponiendo de una manera distinta estas brechas de seguridad. Al mostrarnos en vivo, como lo vieron durante la demo de Chris, todo lo que tiene que ver con vulnerabilidades, errores humanos o configuraciones en un tema de tiempo real en 7x24, ese es el diferencial. XM Cyber siempre nos va a ayudar a responder si realmente las joyas de nuestra corona están totalmente seguras. Estamos acá para que nos molesten, si quieren más dudas, si quieren más información. Estamos aquí durante el stand y de nuevo invitarlos mañana a las 3 de la tarde a la charla que tendremos con Eduardo. No sé, Eduardo,
Perfecto.
si tú vas a complementar algo más.
Claro, perfecto. Me gustaría agradecer por la oportunidad de presentarles y mañana teremos una nueva presentación al mismo tiempo. Gracias y hasta la mañana.
Mañana nos vemos a las 12 y a las 3 contigo. Gracias a todos. Buenas tardes.
Tenemos 2 sesiones la mañana.
Sí,
Perfecto.
Gracias. Buen día.
Gracias. Buenos días.
Gracias, Chris. Thanks, Chris.